A rule of thumb I like to follow is that every single commander deck shouldn't have just one commander. Both my Sliver deck and my Hydra deck are great examples of this. However, the worst example of this is probably my Emry deck. Let's see why. Now, Emry is in fact the commander for this deck, which primarily focuses on graveyard recursion and artifacts. However, there is another artifact-based mono blue commander that, in my opinion, is a lot more fun and much more powerful. But the problem is, no one wants to play with Urza. This deck kind of puts my opponents into a false sense of security because Emry has limitations. Urza is busted. And by the time they realize they're actually facing against an Urza deck, it's a little too late. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the cards and the combos, because that's the fun stuff. Okay, so given that Urza is the pseudo commander that you're really trying to aim for in this deck, first off, there's a metric ton of card draw, which is not hard to do in mono blue, but also it's pretty prominent in artifacts in general as well. Let's go ahead and go through some of the more notable cards. First off, there's a handful of counter spells because blue. And there are about 8 different wincons in this game, not including just random infinite combos. So if you've seen my Yawgmoth deck, this is kind of Oops Infinite Part 2, but the main concept behind this deck is to build a machine, and the machine gets more and more complex as you keep going, and the machine does more and more things. So let's go ahead and dissect some of these combos. First off, infinite mana, there is Basalt Monolith and Rings of Brighthearth. There's also Staff of Domination, so that allows you to either A, gain infinite life, untap target creatures, tap target creatures, or draw a card. So that's infinite versions of those. With the gain infinite life one, there is also Aether Flux Reservoir, which is wincon number 1. And with the draw card, that's wincon number 2 with Laboratory Maniac. Now, this is where Emry actually being the commander does come in handy, because the thing with Urza is that you can create a construct that is a infinite, just because Sign Master Thopterist creates a whole bunch of tokens, and you also create an infinite number of those, so there's that option. However, with Emry specifically being the commander, or in this deck in general, there is also Sir Ginger, which means anytime that a artifact enters the graveyard, you end up also with a infinite gingerbread man, which then you can then sacrifice and then gain that life, which then triggers your Aether Flux Reservoir wincon as well. That now brings us to the last 3 wincons outside of just hitting your opponents. There is Infinite Mill with Codex Shredder. There is the Millennium Calendar, which that one doesn't go infinite, but with Urza you can tap all of your artifacts and then they all untap during your untap step, which gives you a whole bunch of counters on the Millennium Calendar, and then you can also have Unwinding Clock, so then you can keep tapping Millennium Calendar to then double those counters, so that builds up pretty quickly. And the last combo is the Mirrodin Besieged Phyrexian aspect, which is if there's 15 artifacts in your graveyard, you can take out each opponent individually during your upkeep. So you can just go down in order of who's the biggest threat to you. And if there is anyone that's a threat to you, there is also Cyclonic Rift, because blue. That takes care of most of the notable cards and the various different kind of like wincons. Again, but part of it is building the machine to get there. So there are a whole bunch of things that either sacrifice or are okay being sacrificed. Also just generally cheap artifacts, because Emry allows you to cast things from your graveyard. But one particularly broken card in here is KCI, Clark Clan Ironworks. That doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. However, whenever you combine that with the Thopters or with Treasures, it can get out of hand very quickly. Other things that make the machine run a little bit more efficiently, Ethereum Sculptor and Foundry Inspector both make artifacts cheaper. And one infinite combo that kind of sneaks up on you in this deck is Junk Diver, Myr Retriever, and Sculpting Steel. Really, you only need one of the previous 2, but with Sculpting Steel, it allows you to just copy it, so that way you can just bounce those back and forth, and you honestly don't even need Emry for that. So if Emry ends up getting nerfed, or even Urza, you still have an infinite combo. Now that takes out most of the really notable stuff. Again, there's a metric ton of card draw with things like Ristic Study, which actually I don't believe is in here because I do have standards. But Howling Mine, so that way everyone kind of enjoys some card draw, or other just things like that. Now, if you do want to go through the entirety of this deck, there is a deck list in the description below. However, those are the main components of the machine. There are some things like Darksteel Forge that make everything indestructible. But outside that, let's talk about some of the weaknesses. Okay, so one colossal weakness of this deck is that there are not a whole bunch of creatures. There's a bunch of artifacts and enchantments, and there are some artifact creatures. Outside of those, you don't really have a whole bunch of defenders, so if you're playing against someone who's very creature heavy, there's a very good chance you can get punched out before the game really starts to pop off or before you start to build up too much momentum. Now, if you do have Psy out with like Darksteel Forge, you can kind of block with a whole bunch of like 1/1 Thopters, but outside of that, you have to move very quickly. However, if you're playing against something like a mono green deck like Hydras, or if you're playing up against something that's like Krenko Goblins that are just really, really fast, you're kind of up a creek without a paddle. Now, usually people will kind of take a little bit of mercy on you because you're trying to get things going, and it doesn't look like you're doing a whole lot of things until it's too late, so you can kind of play the metagame politicking aspect of that. Outside of that, that is probably the biggest weakness of this deck. Now, the other part is as soon as you play Urza, you better be able to win because people hate Urza. And that is the reason why Emry is the commander of this deck, because I really wanted to build an Urza deck, and I probably will at some point in the future. But the problem is different commanders do have different stigmas. So if I just flat out built an Urza deck, I would probably never even be able to play it outside of a competitive setting. The problem with that though is it's really hard to invest time, energy, and effort into something that you know that people aren't going to want to play against. I feel like it's fair to say that being tricky and the thrill of outsmarting your opponents is a very mono blue thing to do. That makes me sound like an evil scientist. I do think that this is an excellent example of showing synergy across different very powerful cards, because Emry is a little bit more toned down and can be a little bit more casual. But the second Urza hits the battlefield, it cranks the game up to a more serious level, and then you get to see other people's reactions of do they have an answer for those threats. However, like I said previously, there is that deck list in the description below because that starts to get a little bit more into the granularity of the deck and the sneaky ways that you can try and hide Urza or dig for Urza without other people knowing. But with that being said, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.